Okay, let's take a look at Oracle VirtualBox. Now, I currently have, if I go to About VirtualBox, you'll see I'm running version 6.1. That is I believe, the most current version. It should be. I just downloaded it a couple days ago. Okay, now a lot of us have probably looked at VirtualBox before. It's a great platform. If you don't have Windows 10 Pro, Windows 11 Pro, you can't use Hyper-V. So VirtualBox is a great solution for those people who are running Windows 10 or Windows 11 but don't have Pro and don't have access to Hyper-V. It also works on some Linux distributions as well. So it is a very flexible little virtualization platform for desktop virtualization. So what we're looking at is our desktop virtualization solution, not their server virtualization. So you'll use it on your desktop to virtualize a VM or to create a VM, virtualize a system if you're wanting to learn it or practice with it or test it out or something like that. It's not necessarily something you're going to run a virtual server that's going to drive your organization. That's not its intent. Okay, let's take a look at VirtualBox here. So I have the File menu, the Machine menu, and the Help menu. Under the File menu, I can set my preferences. So general preferences, including my default virtual machine folder. I can set my input options, options for updating, for language, for display, for network configurations. Most of these things I don't worry about, but if you want to customize VirtualBox, this is a way that you can do it. You can also get to it here by going to Preferences. So you also have the option to import and export appliances. So an appliance is basically a virtual machine that has been pre-built. So it's set up in order to do this particular task. Somebody builds it, they export it, and then you can import it as an appliance and use it as is. So this gives you the option to import appliance or to create your own and then export it for you to use somewhere else or for somebody else to use it. We also have a virtual media manager where we can set some virtual media. We have and I went too far. We have our host network adapter and our network operations manager. Network operations manager as well, which we don't have any of at the moment. So you'll also see some links here for preferences, import, export, and then this is to create new virtual machines. And you'll also find it here. So the add virtual machine will allow you to take a virtual machine that has been exported earlier and then add it back in. So like I could create a virtual machine, export it, or save the files out. The virtual machine is going to be saved in a couple of files, the machine definition file and then the hard drive file, or more than one if I've got more than one hard drive. So I could take that virtual machine, put it on a flash drive, give it to you. You'd come over and say, hey, I want to add this virtual machine. And then you'd go find it and add the virtual machine in. If you want to create a new virtual machine, though, we go here. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine real quick. And I'm not going to install it. I just want to create it and then look at some of the options on it. So we'll set the machine name. So I'm going to call this test. And then we can choose down here. I can do guided mode, which is pretty basic, or expert mode, which gives me a little more options all at one time. Let's walk through guided mode first. So I'm going to do test, and then I'm going to define the type. Now, this actually doesn't install the operating system for me. What it does is it says, hey, this is what I am building or what I'm trying to build, and then VirtualBox will customize a few settings. You're probably going to want to update them honestly yourself. So I'm going to say I'm going to do a Windows 2019 64-bit. And so that's going to give me my recommended size for RAM is 2 gigabytes. And I'm going to say that is way too little. So I want to bump that up. Notice, by the way, VirtualBox actually lets you go all the way down to 4 megabytes. It will let you go smaller than most other virtualization platforms, which means sometimes you can get some older things to run in VirtualBox you can't anywhere else. For example, a few years ago, I was playing with DOS 6.1 and Windows, or DOS 6.2 and Windows 3.11. And I was able to get it to run under VirtualBox where I couldn't under Hyper-V because the operating system just couldn't recognize what Hyper-V was trying to give it. But with VirtualBox, I could shrink it down enough that the operating system was able to handle it. So I can use my slider here to adjust my amount of memory, or I can just come over here and type what I want. So I'm going to do 4096, which is 4 GB of memory, and click next. All right, and then I can choose not to add a virtual disk. Now, if I don't add a virtual disk, then obviously I'm not going to be able to, store anything to my virtual drive or install an operating system. But sometimes that's okay because we'll build a virtual machine and then we'll add a virtual hard disk later. Sometimes one that's already been pre-installed, and it just simplifies our life. Or I can choose to create a virtual hard disk now, or I can use an existing virtual disk that I've already created. So let's say I'd created a virtual disk, installed Windows on it, then I copied it, and now I want to use that as a basis for this virtual machine. That's how I would do that. Choose not to add it and add it in later, or choose to add it in now. I'm going to go ahead and create a virtual disk now. So I'm going to click create. And then I have one of three different types. So I can do a VDI, a VHD, or a VMDK. VDI is the default, and it is a native virtual disk file for VirtualBox. Now, I don't know about it in this version of VirtualBox, but in previous versions of VirtualBox, I've occasionally had issues trying to get it to use a Hyper-V VHD. But it's something that they try to support. I would say try it, see if it works if you really want to do that. But when I have built VHDs and then tried to export them to VirtualBox, it has not worked well. All right, so I'm just going to go with the VirtualBox disk image, VDI, and click Next. Now, I can choose dynamically allocated or fixed size. Dynamically allocated means it's not going to give me all of the space right away. So if I have a 50 gig hard drive, what's going to happen if I dynamically allocate is it will only allocate enough to get that enough space on the hard drive, enough space in the file to get that started. And then as I copy files into it, as I install an operating system into it, as I install applications, it will allocate more and more space. And so my hard drive will grow. So it might have a 50 gigabyte max, but I might only be using 25 gigabyte on the hard drive. Now, if I do a fixed size, what happens is it allocates all of that space immediately. So I immediately lose 50 gigabytes of available physical storage space. But it also means that I never have to allocate that later on, which means that a fixed size drive actually is going to run a little bit more efficiently. A dynamically allocated is going to be a little more space efficient, but it's not going to have quite the same performance characteristics. Now, because I'm using this as a test platform and not a actual production device, I'm going to use dynamically allocated. In fact, almost everything I do is dynamically allocated because I wouldn't use I wouldn't use VirtualBox to run a production environment that I was going to rely on anyway. But if you needed to do that, let's say you're going to run an Ubuntu virtual machine because you have an app that runs on Ubuntu that you're going to need on a regular basis, and so you're just going to have this permanently running. All right, that might be a case where I would actually do that here. We would do a fixed size drive so that it's going to perform a little bit better. But as a test bed, I'm going to leave it dynamically allocated and click Next. Here's where I'm going to set the file location and the file size. And again, I've got the slider from 4 megabytes all the way up to 2 terabytes. And I'm going to go back to my 50 gigabytes and click Create. Now that creates my virtual machine for me. And so over here, I'm going to see my virtual machines. So here are my tools, and then the welcome, the media, the network center. Here is my virtual machine. And so my options here are I can create a new virtual machine, I can go to the settings, or I can start the virtual machine. So if I click on settings, this is going to let me adjust my virtual machine settings. Now, alternatively, right here, you're going to see all of my settings. So I can come down to my network, and that takes me to my settings and immediately to my network settings, although I can get to all the others as well. Same way, let's say I want to change my storage, then that takes me to my settings storage area. It's the exact same place as if I went here. It just, it's a little bit quicker there. So let's go through our settings real quick. Under general, I have basic, which gives me my name and what it's supposed to be. My advanced is where am I going to store my snapshots? Do I want to do a shared clipboard? Do I want to allow drag and drop between the virtual machine and the host computer. If I'm going to do things like that, by the way, I'm probably going to go ahead and install the guest integration tools. So my description of the virtual machine if I want it, and if I'm enabling disk encryption. Under my system, I have my motherboard base memory, I have my boot order, I have the chipset that we're emulating, the pointing device that we're using, and then any extended features. Under my processor, I have the number of processor cores that are available to this virtual machine, my execution cap. So I might want to back this down and say, all right, I'm going to give you access to 2 processors, but you can't use more than 50% of each processor. And we'll do things like that, add more CPUs, adjust execution caps when we're trying to balance processor usage amongst multiple operating systems. And in this case, I'm going to have my host operating system and my guest operating system, right? So if I max this out, this is a maximum number of physical CPUs that I had. And I said, you can use everything, or physical CPU cores. If I max it out, let's just go ahead and completely max it out all the way. Then theoretically, my virtual machine could eat up all of my processor time and my physical computer wouldn't have any available to it. So that's why we will sometimes back this down. Let's give this thing 2 CPUs and we'll let it max out both of them. And then we have extended features here so we can enable nested virtualization or other tools if we want. And then we have our acceleration, so parallel interface. We can set that if we want. We can enable nested paging. If we go to our display, we have our video memory. We have how many monitors we're going to be trying to use with this. We have the graphics control, and then whether we want to enable 3D acceleration for the virtual machine. Under remote display, we can set up remote display servers. We can also set up recording for the virtual machine. Under storage, here's where I have my controller and I've got my test VDI, that's my hard drive. And I can specify whether it's hot pluggable or treat it like it's on solid state, which you'd want to do, or you'd only want to do if it actually was a solid state drive. And then my CD drive here, I can choose to use a live CD, make it hot pluggable. I can also come over here and choose a disk file. So I'm going to go to my ISOs folder and I'm going to put in my server 2019 ISO, and that will now be mounted as a CD. I can also choose to associate it with a host drive as well if I want. Now, if I want to add additional virtual drives, that would be down here where I can add a new storage controller, and that would remove my selected device. Come down to or click on my controller up here, and then I could remove the selected controller or add new storage attachment. So I can add additional virtual hard drives or additional virtual CD drives. Under my audio, I can enable or disable audio, set what I'm using for my audio controller. For my network, I can have up to 4 network adapters. I can choose to enable or disable each one. So you'll see 2, 3, and 4 are all disabled by default. And then I can define how it's attached to the network. So NAT, or network address translation, what that does is that gives me an IP address for this thing, that for my virtual machine, that is then NATed through the hypervisor. So it allows this machine to get access to the internet, but doesn't necessarily allow it to get unrestricted access to my local area network. If I wanted to get unrestricted access to my local area network, just like it was physically attached, then I would choose a bridged adapter. I can also set it to do an internal network, so to be used by other virtual machines or only the host, or, well, you get the idea. I can also specify, let me go back to NAT here. Let me go back to bridged, because in bridged, then I can specify which Ethernet adapter on my physical computer I want it to go through. And then we have advanced settings. So what adapter type are we allowing or denying promiscuous mode? What's the MAC address? And then I'm going to go back to NAT, which is where I can actually enable port forwarding to allow some kind of forwarding to come back into this device. And like we said, we can do multiple ones with different types. Okay, serial ports, we can enable serial port access if we want. So I can go to COM1 and say, yes, allow this to access COM1, and I can pipe it to the host device or wherever I want it to go. Not something that we find a compelling need to do very often, but it is something that's supported. Under USB, I can enable or choose whether I want to enable USB and then what devices I want. So I can add new USB devices here that I'd plug into my physical computer that will then be accessible to my virtual machine. Shared folders is for transferring data back and forth. I can set up a shared folder. This is going to function like a network shared folder that will allow me to transfer data files from the host to the guest using that shared folder. And then we have our user interface. And this is what it would look like. And then we can customize that user interface. So those are all of our virtual machine settings. Now, in addition to my virtual machine settings, I can click this option right here for my options. This will give me my details, which is where I've been at. My snapshots will let me take snapshots, delete snapshots, restore to snapshots. It'll also let me clone my virtual machine. So I can clone. Let me go ahead and then, settings will take you back to your virtual machine settings. So if I clone my virtual machine right here, I can create a duplicate copy of this virtual machine. And again, I have guided mode and expert mode. And expert mode gives me a couple of other options. I can link off of a current snapshot or clone off a current snapshot or clone everything. I can also choose to do a full clone or a linked clone. And a full clone just creates a whole separate individual unit that replicates the hard drive and everything. A linked clone actually ties the two together. So the clone functions independently, but it still uses the base files of this machine, which means if I delete this thing, my linked clone doesn't work. If I do a full clone and I delete this thing, then my linked clone continues to work just fine. But where this might be beneficial would be, let's say, if you had 4 kids and you wanted to create a virtual machine for each one. And so you could do linked clones. You could create a base system and then create linked clones. And then as long as your base system's intact, it keeps you from replicating storage, like, the operating system being stored 4 different times. It would just be stored in the parent clone. Okay, so that's what our cloning is. And then logs is going to show us all of our log files. We also right click. We'll see, we've seen several of these before. Settings, clone, move, export to OCI, so we can export the virtual machine. We can remove it. We can also create virtual machine groups, which is very convenient. If we have a bunch of virtual machines, we might want to group them to make them easier to manage rather than just having 20 things in a big long list here. And then wrong button, right click. And we also have the option here to remove our virtual machine. And this does something that Hyper-V doesn't. I want to show it to you real quick. So when I go to remove, it gives me the option to remove only or to delete all files. Now, remove only takes it out of the VirtualBox manager, so I don't see it anymore. I don't see it anymore. I can go in and add it later, though it doesn't get rid of it. Delete all files actually wipes it completely. And this is really interesting. Hyper-V allows you to remove a virtual machine, and what it does is it gets rid of the virtual machine definition, but it leaves the VHD file, it leaves the hard drive there, which in some cases is great, right? Because you may want to come back and use that hard drive a little bit later. But if you don't want to do that, then you have to go out and manually delete the hard drive. VirtualBox gives you the ability to delete everything all at once, and that's going to take it all out. And so I just delete it all goes away. And this brings me back to, it's actually trying to go to my network settings for my VirtualBox host adapter. And go back to welcome. There we go. Okay, that gives you a hopefully real quick but thorough enough overview of VirtualBox and what you can do with it. Now, we didn't install the operating system. Let me go ahead and create a new virtual machine and show you how to. We're not going to install one, but I just want to show you how to start it up real quick. Okay, so let me go away from my log and go to my details. So to start a virtual machine, I would click this, and this will start my virtual machine for me. And it started on my other monitor. So let me go and drag it back over here. And this is where my virtual machine would actually be running. And I have nothing for it to boot off of right now, so it's not going anywhere. But under here, you'll see your preferences. So you can set VirtualBox preferences. And this is what we looked at on our main preferences earlier on. For our virtual machine, we can take a snapshot from here. We can look at our session information, pause, reset, shut down, and look at our settings. We can choose to view in full screen mode or in scaled mode, adjust the window size, enable recording, modify the window bar, modify the status bar. We can set our input for our keyboard, including here is where we would do like the insert Control Alt Delete. Because if we hit Control Alt Delete, it's going to be picked up by our physical computer, not by the host. But notice we have a predefined host plus delete that will send a Control Alt Delete to the system. We can also look at devices that are attached to it and add or remove devices from here as well. So when we're done with it, yes, I know, go away. When we're done with it, I am going to try to shut down. Oh, let me close those right there. Failed, no bootable system. All right, system halted. So if the machine was operational, I can do a shutdown. I can also just close. This doesn't turn it off unless I tell it to. So close gives me the option to save the machine state. It won't be running anymore. It'll just be, like suspended animation. I can choose to send the shutdown signal, or I can power off the virtual machine. My send the shutdown signal is inactive because I don't have an OS that will recognize it. So I will just power off the virtual machine, and that takes it down. All right, one more time. I will remove my virtual machine and delete all files, and hopefully now you've got some background to work with Oracle VirtualBox.